Adults of Reddit born prior to 1980, do you remember the Chernobyl disaster? What were you doing and what was your reaction upon learning what happened? I'm American. My friend was engaged to a guy from Russia, who also lived here in the States. His mother and grandmother were still living in Kiev. I remember him trying for around a week to get in touch with them. It was really scary and stressful, and I remember his tears of relief when he finally spoke with his mother. She was okay, his gran was okay. They never left, and were far enough away from ground zero that they just stayed there. How'd he get out of the Soviet Union? He joined the Israeli army and defected. I was in the 5th grade, and I remember learning about it on the evening news with my parents likely several days or weeks after it happened, and being very worried it would start a nuclear war. I basically thought pretty much everyone in Russia was dead, or was going to die and we were next. So, I put all of my treasures in my backpack and carried them around with me for the next several days waiting for the bombs to fall. Also, I lived in a house with a bomb shelter which just fueled the imagination of my nuclear panic, so obviously I had granola bars in there. When they didn't, over time I became terribly worried about all the animals that were mutated and that all of the fruits and vegetables that were all contaminated with fallout. Anytime I saw fruits or vegetables that had weird shapes, I thought they were radioactive. Any oddity, like the neighbor's cross-eyed cat, I went straight to contaminated with fallout. As an adult, when I see a really odd-shaped fruit I don't think, that's neat, there's still a teeny part of me that thinks it's probably radioactive. Not to further your fears, but a lot of fruit are more radioactive than other foods due to their natural uptake in potassium, which some isotopes are naturally radioactive, K40. You can actually refer to doses of radiation in terms of some fruits digested. But steady low doses of radiation have actually been known to help grow plants, the most scientific version of banana for scale. I was born in 1982, in Moscow, Russia. My mom and grandma were both biologists. My mom worked at an institute specializing in biowarfare. Grandma was doing cancer research, and were on the train from Kiev, Ukraine back to Moscow when the explosion happened. The government flat out lied to people and nobody found out until later. I recall videos of hundreds of buses of people from Ukraine evacuating into Moscow. Back then it was part of the USSR. After that, my dad carried a Geiger counter everywhere we went, checking all the produce for radiation. We had acid rains, so everybody was told to walk with an umbrella. My mom once wore blue socks and the rain stained her feet blue from the acidity. We were told that walking in the rain would cause baldness. I worked with an engineer from Kyiv that was bald. He said that they were offering a full day of pay for 1 hour of work at the road barricades, measuring and recording the radiation of all the vehicles going in and out. He said he did that for a couple of weeks. One day, it rained. All his hair fell out. He is still bald. Great guy and excellent engineer. He also has some crazy stories about he and his wife and son packing backpacks to leave the country, illegally, and the arguments over what to take in the escape itself. Really eye-opening stuff to my fresh out of university Canadian mind. I remember it. I am in Australia and thought it was so far away it would not really affect us here. I am even old enough to recall 3 Mile Island, so Chernobyl wasn't a huge shock after that, except that TMI was a partial meltdown because of a combination human error in stuck valve led to the accidental release of coolant. Nobody was killed and Harrisburg hasn't seen an increase in cancer following it. What it to do was crystallize fears of nuclear power, which was already under attack. Arguably, this hastened global warming. Meanwhile, more nuclear material is released in the atmosphere by your average coal fire plant each year. We have too much lead and depression in our water for radiation create any noticeable effects. Not me, but my parents. We live in Croatia, which is not that far from Chernobyl. I asked them what it was like during that time. They said that they did not even knew that it happened at first. It only came out in public like 10 days later because the Soviets tried to cover it up. The moment that the rest of the Europe found out about it, they immediately said on all TV stations that they must wash every piece of vegetables, fruit or any kind of food to great extent, and that they advised to stay in houses if they do not need to be outside. Not long ago my parents had some really stupid political discussion about our country and I just said so. The effects of Chernobyl are finally kicking in, eh? I'm from Czech Republic and my dad told me the same. Basically had no idea until 10 days later. People started taking iodine supplements to prevent damage of the thyroid gland. I'm not sure about the specifics, but I remember iodine and thyroid gland. Also, I heard some rumors about children being born with some defects at the time, but that's mostly anecdotal and I'm not sure if it wasn't just a hoax. Potassium iodide is a quick way of supplying your body with iodine, particularly your thyroid gland. By providing readily available and not radioactive iodine as a preventative measure, you can decrease the amount of iodine-131 absorbed, which is a common radioactive isotope released by uranium and plutonium fission reaction. I-131 is a major health hazard due to its radioactivity, its tendency to accumulate in the thyroid, and just how much is released by nuclear diasters. By flooding your body with iodine that is not radioactive, you make it much more difficult for your body to absorb the iodine that is radioactive, decreasing your risk of complications such as thyroid cancer. It won't protect you from radiation sickness or cancer risk from other sources, but it's a cheap and easy way to lessen your risk of thyroid cancer, so it's worth a shot if you're going to be exposed to fallout or fission products. Not me, but my wife. She was working with radioactive substances at the time, in London, and the delicately precise experiments weren't coming out as they should have done, and they couldn't figure out why not. This was before the Soviet government released the whole truth, of course. More chillingly, shortly after the disaster, her research institute hosted a couple of scientists from Kiev. They said they'd been told there'd been a minor accident, nothing to worry about, and they knew it was total bullshit because all their radiation badges had suddenly gone completely black. When it's all black, they give you a new one. When it's all black, they give you a coffin. Oh. First thing I thought of when you mentioned the badge. Not me, but my older brother was already born and remembers. People were told to take care of special food, e.g. nuts or stuff made from nuts. All the self-grown food like apples and potatoes was thrown away. People were really afraid of what will happen to them and how big the damages will be. I was in the Air Force at the time, US, and worked in an ICBM nuclear missile wing. I knew it was bad news. Very bad. You're like the two-button sweating guy meme, except there's only one button, well, two keys, and two sweaty guys. I am from Czech Republic, back then it was still Czechoslovakia. I wasn't born yet, but my mom has a story. My mom was in the first May Parade, a communist thing where many people had to walk with flags throughout the entire town. Those clouds were in the sky, it was raining a bit. Nobody told them anything, that happened, that it may be harmful to walk outside. It's crazy when you think about it now with all the precautions, but I guess nobody wanted to ruin the 1st of May celebrations upcoming, the day when you celebrate work. Austrian here, born in 1983. One of my father's friends was in an army maneuver when the radioactive dirt rained down on them. The army most likely knew about it, but didn't care enough to protect their own soldiers. My father's friend died of cancer in the early 1990s. Also, a neighbor of us was jogging in the radioactive rain. He lost all his hair in the weeks afterwards, and it never grew back. As for myself, all I remember is that we had to take iodine tablets for years afterwards. They were regularly given to us in kindergarten and later in primary school. My mom, Germany, always told me that they were told in school to not go collecting mushrooms in the woods, which she did regularly. Also, drinking milk wasn't possible for a few months until detailed analyses were published. Eating mushrooms was supposedly dangerous for decades due to the radioactive fallout staying in the soil forever and mushrooms absorbing it. Fun fact, Austrian woods still have cesium from Chernobyl rains in their soil. While the levels tested in milk can be far insignificant, they can be exceeding the health limits in both wild bear meat and mushrooms in certain areas. Although I only vaguely remember the disaster, there is an interesting story about two particular people's reaction to the news. When BBC Radio 1 announced the news that the Chernobyl disaster had occurred, the DJ, Steve Wright, immediately followed the tragic news by playing Wham's I'm Your Man. Morrissey and Johnny Marr were listening. Marr said, "What the fuck does this got to do with people's lives?" And it led them to write the song Panic, Hang a Blessed DJ, because the music they constantly play, it says nothing to me about my life. I was in secondary school in the UK. People were worried. There were scares about eating certain types of food, or food from some countries. At the time, there were a lot of food scares, and I remember being bored of that. Lots of people were suddenly super interested in high-altitude winds to work out if fallout dust was coming our way. I remember thinking that sounds bad, but it wasn't until a long time later that I understood the plight of the people who were affected. Primary school, in Somerset, for me, but I was quite a precocious kid and was glued to the news once the scale of it became clear. I remember asking my dad what our plans were in case the radiation was as bad as we feared it could be, expecting him to say that we'd all get on a plane and head to New Zealand to live with our family there. Dad was a Kiwi and we all held NZ passports, and he just said straight up that we'd probably all get sick and die. If it was that bad, they wouldn't be flying normal people out of the country, and a lot of neighboring, European, countries would probably close their borders. Cheers, Dad. My mother's story: she was a pretty junior civil engineer on the East Coast, the only one in the office on a Sunday. She took a call from an engineering/science group in Europe, asking to get air quality readings from her firm's monitoring equipment, which, if I recall correctly, was set up at a different location in Europe. The headquarters was just in the US. They were picking up elevated radiation and didn't know where it was coming from. My mom ended up calling her boss's boss in on a Sunday, and they all coordinated a triangulation, with a third measuring location, of what direction the elevated radiation was coming from, in Belarus. This was long before the USSR reported that anything happened or admitted to a nuclear disaster. Suddenly, my mom was the person in the firm with the most experience in nuclear engineering, that is, any at all. And nuclear was the biggest field to be involved in, overnight. They sent her to get more training and certifications, and she ended up as a nuclear reactor safety inspector for a while. So yeah, my mom was probably the first civilian in North America to hear about Chernobyl, and it changed the path of her career.